She walked into the airport with credentials, confidence, and clearance. But none of that stopped the cuffs. 2 officers saw her skin before they saw her badge, and what followed shook the system. She didn't yell, didn't beg, didn't break. She stood still and let the truth expose them all. This isn't just a story about injustice. It's a reckoning. The air inside Terminal C of Eastbridge International was dry and over-perfumed. Travelers moved in controlled chaos, dragging luggage, checking watches, dodging strollers. But Dr. Naomi Blake walked through it all with the calm confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged. Tailored navy blue coat, low heels, tablet in hand. Her ID badge, tucked discreetly inside her clutch, bore the federal seal and the unmistakable name, Homeland Intelligence Division. She didn't wear power, she carried it. Gate 42 was straight ahead. She had a security briefing at 3 p.m., and the panel convened at 6. It was her 4th visit to Eastbridge this year. Never once had she been late, flagged, or stopped. But as she approached the security checkpoint, she noticed something different in the posture of the officers. 2 men, one stocky with a buzz cut, the other lean and flushed, exchanged glances when they saw her. A pause, a twitch of the radio mic. And then they stepped forward. "Ma'am," said the taller one, stepping into her path, "we need to do a secondary screening. Right this way." Naomi blinked, confused but unshaken. "I've already cleared pre-check, and I'm federal. You should have seen that." "We need to verify a few things," the shorter one added, without looking her in the eye. She took a slow breath, then calmly reached into her clutch. "My credentials are here. Special Investigator Blake, Homeland Intelligence Division. I'm on assignment." She handed them the badge. They glanced at it, then at each other, then back at her. Buzzcut officer smirked. This could be fake. Naomi tilted her head. "It's not. You can scan the QR code or run the clearance number." Neither moved. People were watching now. A family nearby had paused mid-conversation. A businessman whispered something to the woman next to him. Naomi felt the heat creeping up her neck. Not from shame, but from memory. She'd been here before, not in this airport, not with this badge, but in this moment. The one where professionalism collides with someone else's assumptions. "You're making a mistake," she said. "One that's going to escalate fast if you don't—" "Hands where I can see them," the taller one said, suddenly sharp. "We're detaining you for further questioning." A few gasps rippled through the terminal. A phone camera clicked. Naomi stood her ground. "I'm telling you again," she said, voice low but clear. "You are violating protocol, federal law, and common sense. Turn around." She didn't move. "Ma'am, don't make this harder than it has to be." She locked eyes with the officer. "You already did that." The first touch was rough, not violent, but demeaning. They took her arms and twisted them behind her back with practiced ease. Cold metal wrapped around her wrists. Passengers stared openly now. Phones came out. One child asked, "Mom, what did she do?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't say another word as they walked her through the terminal like a criminal, past the food court, past the newsstand that had her face on a magazine cover last year, past the security cameras she knew were recording every second of this. They brought her into a small, windowless room near the back of the checkpoint area. No clocks, no chairs. One fluorescent light flickering overhead. They stood her against the wall and began asking the same questions. "What's your real name? What's your immigration status? Where'd you get this badge?" Naomi stared at the officer. "Do you want me to recite the 4th clause of federal protocol on detaining intelligence officials, or will you look at the credentials you're holding?" Buzzcut didn't answer. The lean one stepped outside with her ID. Minutes passed. Then more. 15 minutes turned to 30. No one spoke. No one offered water. She stood perfectly still, wrists aching, jaw clenched. And then, a knock on the door, followed by the sound of someone entering quickly, their footsteps purposeful. "Uncuff her," came a voice Naomi hadn't heard before. Deep, controlled, senior. What? The lean officer said, returning with a pale face. I said uncuff her. Now. They hesitated. The man stepped forward, tall, salt and pepper hair, badge clearly visible on his lapel. Captain Marcus Bell, Internal Security. That woman, he said, pointing at Naomi, has higher clearance than either of you will ever see in your careers. You just detained a senior Homeland operative on U.S. soil during a domestic security operation. The two officers froze. Naomi turned slowly, letting the words settle. Her hands were released. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't flinch. She just stared. Captain Bell looked at her. Ma'am, I'm sorry. This should never have happened. Naomi's voice was ice. But it did, he nodded. I'll be filing the report myself. She picked up her credentials from the table. You'll need more than a report. Then she walked out, past the stunned officers, past the cameras, past the eyes that had watched her humiliation unfold in real time. And outside, beyond the terminal glass, the sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows across a place that had just learned who she really was. The hallway outside the security office felt quieter than Naomi remembered. Not physically. The announcement still buzzed over the intercom, babies still cried, and wheels still rolled over tile. But the attention had shifted. Wherever she walked, silence followed. People didn't look away from her anymore. They stared, wide-eyed and unsure whether to feel sympathy, guilt, or fear. She walked straight ahead, shoulders back, face unreadable. The room she had just left behind was still echoing with questions, not hers, but the officers. She didn't need answers. She needed air. Captain Bell followed behind her at a respectful distance, but his expression was taut with unease. He wasn't new, Naomi could tell. He had the posture of a man who had been watching institutions fail in slow motion for too long, but even he had been startled. I've put in a call to the Federal Liaison Office, he said as he caught up with her. They'll flag this for internal review. And for the record, I've already started a complaint report against both officers. Naomi didn't slow down. Do you think that changes anything? Bell hesitated. It's a start. No, she replied. It's cleanup. They reached the private terminal entrance, a quieter wing where federal guests and diplomats moved through less chaos. The guard posted at the door immediately straightened. He knew who she was now. The world did. Captain Bell sighed. You should know. There's footage of everything. There always is, Naomi said. It's already online. She paused for half a second. Let it spread. Are you sure? They turned me into a suspect before they even looked at my name. Maybe the world should watch what that looks like in real time. He nodded, slowly. I'm truly sorry, Dr. Blake. No, she said, her tone level. You're responsible. There's a difference. With that, she stepped through the private gate, leaving him behind in the half-light of institutional shame. Inside the conference lounge, a polished assistant greeted her with visible discomfort. She'd clearly heard. Everyone had. Dr. Blake, she said cautiously, your meeting has been pushed back to accommodate your experience. There's water and tea waiting in the lounge if you'd prefer to. I'd prefer to proceed as planned, Naomi interrupted. The assistant nodded, eyes darting. Of course. This way. The briefing room was sleek and cold, glass-walled with the city skyline behind it. Naomi stood at the window for a long moment, breathing in the view. She had been here before. Not this room exactly, but this position, the one where she had to gather every ounce of professionalism and poise after someone had stripped her of basic dignity. She didn't cry. She didn't rage. She didn't let the room take anything more from her. Instead, she pulled out her phone. There were over 100 notifications. News headlines already popping up. Federal agent mistakenly detained at JFK. Racial profiling incident at major U.S. Airport sparks backlash. And beneath them, video clips, grainy footage from bystanders. Her voice, calm but firm. The officers refusing to scan her badge, the moment her wrists were cuffed. She watched it once, then again. Then she closed her phone and opened her laptop. By the time the internal affairs liaison from the Department of Justice arrived, Naomi had already compiled a full report with timestamps, procedural violations, and the names of every officer who had come within 5 feet of her during the EET incident. She didn't wait to be asked. She laid it on the table as soon as he sat down. "I'm not here for sympathy," she said. "I'm here for accountability." The liaison, a man in his 40s with tired eyes and a crisp blue tie, nodded slowly. "We've launched a parallel investigation. The officers in question have been suspended without pay pending review. That's not enough. We understand." "No," Naomi said, firmer. "You don't. You won't. Until you stop calling this a mistake." He leaned forward slightly. "What would you call it?" She looked him in the eye. "A symptom." He didn't argue, just pressed his lips together and reached for the report. After the meeting, Naomi walked outside for the first time since arriving in New York. The sun had dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the pavement. Cars moved in patterns. People bustled around, unaware of the weight the city had dropped on her shoulders in the last 4 hours. She stood alone near the curb. Then a voice behind her. A woman, stranger, early 30s, holding her phone. "Dr. Blake?" Naomi turned. "I just saw the video. Online." Naomi nodded. "I just wanted to say, I saw what they did, and I'm sorry. I don't know if that means anything coming from me, but it means more than silence," Naomi said. The woman hesitated, then added, "It's going viral. People are angry, like really angry." Naomi didn't respond. "I hope you're okay," the woman said. Naomi looked at her. "I'm not." A beat of silence. "But I will be." The woman nodded and left. Naomi stood there a moment longer, watching the taxis, the families, the flow of everyday life as it kept going, unaware, unbothered. And yet, somewhere deep beneath the glass and concrete, a fracture had formed. Small, sharp, quiet, but real. She knew that's where change started, not with shouting, not with press releases, but with someone refusing to play small in a room that tried to shrink them. And she had no intention of ever being small again. By the time the morning news cycle caught up, the damage had already been done. The footage from the airport, 46 seconds long, recorded vertically on an iPhone, had already been reposted more than 2 million times. Naomi didn't watch it again. She didn't need to. Every frame was burned into her memory, the cold grip of the handcuffs, the crowd watching in stunned silence, the officers standing over her like they'd found what they were looking for. She didn't cry. She didn't scream. And now she wasn't going to explain. At 8:09 a.m., her office inbox was flooded. Journalists, government agencies, advocacy groups. Some asked for a statement, some asked for permission to publish her name. Some tried to book her for interviews before noon. The subject lines blurred together. Clarification request. Comment on incident. Public response needed. She ignored them all. Instead, she walked into her scheduled meeting at the Department of Federal Oversight headquarters, right on time, wearing the same sharp lines and steady expression that had built her career. Inside the conference room, 3 men in suits sat waiting. One of them stood as she entered, Director Alan Breyer, her immediate superior. He gestured for her to sit. She didn't. "We want to first express—" "Don't," she said calmly. "I don't need a pre-written apology." Breyer cleared his throat. "What happened was unacceptable." "Yes, and predictable." That silenced them. She placed a single folder on the table. In there is a full procedural breakdown of the violations committed by Officers Dane and Henderson, including timestamps, legal precedent, and relevant security footage excerpts from your own servers. I also included written witness testimony, not mine, theirs. Breyer looked down at the folder but didn't touch it. Naomi continued, "You won't fix this with a press conference. You won't make it go away by suspending 2 uniforms. And you definitely won't soften it by making me your spokesperson." Breyer straightened in his seat. "We assumed you'd want to be part of the solution." "I've been part of the solution," Naomi said. "That didn't stop them from treating me like a threat in my own country, with a badge in my hand." He hesitated. "What do you want us to do?" "I want you to stop protecting a culture that thinks badges grant permission to dehumanize. I want institutional teeth, not corporate language, and I want their names to follow them, not get buried under bureaucracy." There was a beat of silence. Then Breyer nodded once, slowly. "You'll get it." Naomi finally sat down. Across the city, the fallout spread like ink on paper. Protests began forming outside Eastbridge Terminal by late afternoon. Not massive crowds, not yet, but enough to make the news helicopters circle. Enough to force the airport into damage control mode. The Port Authority released a statement calling the incident regrettable. The mayor's office offered concern. And somewhere in a tucked-away office, a senior official tried to decide how much of an internal scandal could be kept out of the headlines. It was too late. Naomi returned to her hotel just after sunset. Her room was quiet, untouched. She left the lights off, walked to the window, and stared out at the city. Below, the street pulsed with life, taxis, late dinners, impatient horns, but all she could hear was the echo of the officer's voice. "Turn around." A knock interrupted her thoughts. She opened the door to find a woman, tall, composed, with a press badge around her neck. "I'm sorry to show up like this," the woman said, "but I couldn't get through any other way." Naomi raised an eyebrow. "That's not comforting." "I'm not here for a quote," she added quickly. "I'm here because I've covered security for 8 years, and this is the first time I've seen someone in your position push back this hard. I thought you'd want to know. Your silence is louder than anything they're saying." Naomi paused, then opened the door wider. "Then listen carefully," she said, "because I'll only say it once." They sat across from each other for 15 minutes. No cameras, no recorders. Naomi didn't offer sound bites. She told the truth about the erosion of trust, the unspoken rules of survival, the exhaustion of being measured against myths every time she walked into a room. The journalist didn't interrupt, didn't polish her notes. She just listened. When she left, Naomi walked back to the window and stood there in the dark, watching as something invisible and irreversible passed through the city, like the quiet before a reckoning. The press conference wasn't her idea. In fact, Naomi had declined it twice before finally agreeing, not because she needed to speak, but because too many people were speaking for her. The room was packed. Cameramen elbowed for position, reporters whispered names they'd mispronounced yesterday, and somewhere in the back row, a young intern hit record with shaking fingers. Naomi stood behind the podium without notes, flanked by 2 officials who said nothing, but looked very official doing so. She didn't wear a suit today. She wore black, not dramatic, not tactical, just precise. Her hair pulled back, no jewelry, no smile. "My name," she said, "is Dr. Naomi Blake." The room quieted. "I've worked in federal intelligence for over 2 decades. I've advised administrations, led international investigations, and helped dismantle corrupt security infrastructures across 4 continents. But 3 days ago, I was treated like a suspect in my own country. Not because of what I'd done, not because of a security alert, but because 2 men saw my skin before they saw my credentials." The silence deepened. They handcuffed me, ignored federal identification, asked if I spoke English. And when the truth finally caught up to them, it wasn't met with apology. It was met with silence. Silence from the airport. Silence from the agencies that trained them. Silence from those who know this happens every day and still call it an accident. She looked out across the crowd. I am not here today to recount what happened to me. I am here to remind you that it never should have. Afterward, she stepped down without waiting for questions. Reporters yelled them anyway. Do you plan to sue the department? Is this about race or protocol? Will you resign from your post? She didn't answer any of them. Her silence had already said more than their sound bites ever could. By noon, the footage from the press conference had joined the original airport video in trending rotations across every platform. Cable news panels debated the meaning of the word profiling like it had just been invented. Hashtags surged. Gertrude Naomi Blake, your she belongs here. Your system not mistake. An op-ed in the Times called her an elegant rebuke to institutional arrogance. An influencer posted a selfie with the caption, Dr. Blake is the moment. Naomi didn't care about any of it. She was back in her hotel room reading disciplinary memos and internal correspondence from the Department of Federal Oversight. Officer Dane had been suspended without pay. Officer Henderson had been placed on indefinite leave pending psychological review. Neither had issued a public apology. Neither had contacted her. She didn't want their words. She wanted their removal. A knock came at her door. This time, it was Rena Alvarez, a regional director from Homeland's legal division, with whom Naomi had worked on counterintelligence audits years before. Rena walked in slowly, holding a folder and a familiar look of reluctant honesty. I wanted to give this to you in person, Rena said. Naomi opened the folder. Inside were scans of internal communications between the airport's security contractors, flagging misaligned behavior, lack of verification training, and ongoing bias concerns. One email was dated 2 weeks before Naomi's incident. It had gone ignored. I figured, Naomi said. Rena exhaled. It's bad. They knew. They didn't act. Because it hadn't gone viral yet. Rena hesitated. What do you want to happen, Naomi? Naomi looked at her. Everything they fear. By that evening, the Department of Justice had announced a joint task force review of airport policing procedures, citing systemic failure to identify and prevent racialized detainment. Public hearings were scheduled. Civil rights groups called for federal policy reform. Naomi's name appeared in draft legislation. But behind all the noise, she sat in the dark, staring at the blank notepad in front of her. She wasn't looking for attention. She was trying to understand why justice only knocked after humiliation made the news cycle. Later that night, she received a message from someone unexpected, the daughter of a woman who'd been wrongly detained at that same airport 2 years earlier. A case that never made headlines, a complaint that was never processed. The message read, they erased her, but because of you, they can't do it again. Naomi sat with those words for a long time. Not because they comforted her, but because they reminded her what was at stake when people decide silence is easier than action. She opened her notepad and began to write, not a statement, not a report, but a plan. A way to shift the system from performance to protection. To make the next woman's badge matter before the cuffs. The world had reacted. Now it was time to rebuild. 2 weeks later, the same airport smelled different. Not because the air had changed, but because she had. Naomi walked through Terminal C again, this time without escort, without a press badge, without fanfare. Just a black blazer, a carry-on, and her name, which now meant something to the people who used to look through her. The same checkpoint where she had been handcuffed now had new signage above it. Enhanced ID verification, civil rights protocols in effect. She didn't smile when she saw it. She just nodded once, as if to say, too late, but not too little. A new officer waved her forward, young, nervous. He scanned her ID and blinked as the system flagged it with a blue star, high-level clearance. Welcome back, Dr. Blake, he said, clearing his throat. She said nothing, but he felt the weight of her silence and didn't try to explain it away. That, in itself, was progress. Further down the terminal, she passed a digital display highlighting the Department of Transportation's new partnership with Homeland Intelligence, a series of training modules and policy reforms she had helped draft. Her name wasn't on the screen. She didn't need it to be. The work spoke. She arrived at Gate 21, where a private panel was being held, not a press event, not a ceremony, but a closed-door session with high-ranking airport executives, internal affairs, and federal oversight staff. Her seat was already marked. The room fell quiet when she entered. They were all watching her now, but not like before. Not with suspicion, with awareness. The kind that only comes after being forced to look. Naomi stood at the front and didn't speak right away. She let the silence settle, not awkward, but earned. Then she placed a single photo on the table. It was grainy, taken from airport surveillance footage, 2 officers detaining her, her hands behind her back, her face calm. "This isn't about me," she said. "This is about how easy it was for this to happen." No one interrupted. "I had credentials, a name, and a record that should have protected me. But those weren't the first things they saw. And for most people, they're never seen at all." She looked around the room. You don't fix that with software or a workshop. You fix that by changing the instinct to distrust before you verify. You change it by making dignity non-negotiable. One executive shifted in his seat, but said nothing. After the session, several people approached her. Some offered thanks. Some admitted discomfort. One, a mid-level director with graying temples, simply said, "We should have done better before this." Naomi nodded. "Then do better after it." Back at her hotel that evening, she sat by the window with a cup of tea and the city flickering outside like a breathing thing. The inbox on her tablet had grown again, new offers, speaking requests, interview invitations, all calling her brave. But she didn't feel brave. She felt tired. Still, she answered one message. It came from a girl named Layla, a law student who'd seen the video and decided to change her thesis topic to civilian profiling in federal transportation systems. Layla had written, "I used to think you had to be loud to be heard, but you stood there in silence and the world still listened. Thank you for that." Naomi replied with a single line, "The world listened because I refused to disappear." Later, as she prepared to leave the city, she made one final stop, not to the terminal, not to the press, but to the office of the newly appointed Director of Equity Compliance. She handed him a folder. Inside was a draft proposal for a national policy reform initiative, one that would make federal travel protections part of civil rights enforcement, not just optional guidelines. She said only 2 words, "Make it law." Then she turned and left. No applause, no cameras, just the sound of her heels on the marble floor, a rhythm that echoed, not as a reminder of pain, but as a new kind of presence, permanent, undeniable. Share your opinion about this story in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe and like so you don't miss new stories.